unheard. This slow torture, this killing in detail, is much less humane than if they ordered me to be shot at once.
200 years ago, Napoleon Bonaparte was taken across the Atlantic Ocean into exile on the island of St. Helena. During the voyage, the Emperor of the French played endless games of cards with his British military captors and constantly raked over the past.
I was at the head of an army at 24. At 30, from nothing, I had risen to be at the head of my country. As Emperor, I should have died the day after I entered Moscow.
On the 14th of October 1815, Napoleon caught his first sight of the island of St. Helena. "It's not an attractive place," he said despondently, as he looked out over the vast mass of volcanic rock. "I'd have done better," he said, "to have stayed in Egypt." Napoleon's foreboding was justified, since at the summer residence of the British Lieutenant Governor, he lived the life of a hermit, and he suffered an indignity and provincialism that was profoundly at odds with the splendid palaces and hero worship that he had once enjoyed. Exile was never going to be easy for a man who had ruled an empire of 45 millions. But as Napoleon himself said, "Other men's downfall diminished them. My own has only raised me to infinite heights." And what heights this extraordinary man had achieved. Victories whose names resonate in military history and which won him the mastery of Europe.
Love of one's country is of all human instincts the most enduring. It is innate in every child, and it persists until death. No feeling is more difficult to eradicate.
From his ruthless shooting of insurrectionists in the streets of Paris in 1795, to his defeat of Austria on the battlefield of Austerlitz in 1805, from his resounding victory over Russia and Prussia at the Battle of Friedland in 1807 to his near obliteration of Prussia that year, from his Europe-wide blockade of British trade to command of an empire of over 40 million people, not to mention ownership of 39 palaces, the career of the Corsican artillery officer turned dictator turned emperor of France was truly glorious. Yet it was in September 1812, in these remote fields west of Moscow, that Napoleon Bonaparte, now in his early 40s, as ever devoted to the honour of France, behaved in a way utterly at odds with the past. And he made a major tactical error, the first of a series of mistakes that would ultimately destroy him. Here, at Borodino, Napoleon adopted a strategy that was unusually cautious. His generals criticised him for this at the time, and historians have castigated him for it ever since. His reasons were impeccable. His caution, however, unfortunately, proved ultimately self-defeating. In the past, Napoleon had won important military victories by outflanking the enemy. But here at Borodino, in the early weeks of the most daring military campaign of his career, the invasion of Russia, he followed a very different tactic. He insisted upon a frontal attack on the enemy, and the battle that followed fast became a bloodbath. In a small battlefield by Napoleonic standards, only 3 miles by 3 miles, 250,000 men fought for 10 hours. 2 million rounds of ammunition were fired and no fewer than 90,000 cannonballs. So every second, 3 cannonballs and 7 bullets were fired, which meant that there was a 30% chance of being killed or wounded. And to be wounded pretty much meant that your limb was going to be amputated. One doctor alone, in the 24-hour period of the battle, actually cut off 200 limbs. It was a most monstrous massacre. 70,000 men were killed or wounded at Borodino, over 27,000 of them French, the bloodiest single day of battle until 1914. On the evening after the battle, Napoleon dined with 2 of his marshals. According to Baron Beausset-Roquefort, his chamberlain and prefect of the palace,
contrary to custom, he was much flushed. His hair was disordered, and he appeared fatigued. His heart was grieved at having lost so many generals and soldiers.
Napoleon had always been the most audacious of men, and the confidence and benevolence of his dictatorship had served France well. The Revolution of 1789 had been a great moment of hope for the country. However, the overthrow of the monarchy and feudal aristocracy was soon followed by chaos. It's easy for us to forget the sheer collective trauma that France underwent in the decade after 1789, when the French Revolution broke out. There was an invasion. There was a terror which killed up to 40,000 people in Paris. There was a collapse of the money markets and wild runaway inflation. There was the abolition of the Catholic Church after 1,000 years of history. All these things came together to leave France traumatized, and the thing that brought them back together as a nation was Napoleon. He was felt to be the saviour of France. It had taken immense leadership, opportunism, and innovation to free France from that ordeal. And it bred in Napoleon an at times breathtaking conceit. As he once wrote,
"If the emperor desired any title, it would be that of Caesar. But the name has been dishonored by so many petty princes. The emperor's title is Emperor of the French."
But the emperor had every right to be proud, since, with the birth of an heir in 1811 by the Empress Marie-Louise, he had founded a Bonaparte dynasty. It helped to legitimize his rule. The emperor was delighted by his son, writing to his former wife, Josephine,
"My son is a big, healthy child. I trust he will do well. He has my chest, my mouth, and my eyes. I trust he will fulfill his destiny."
However, to reinforce the security of France, and because the revolution had not spread to other parts of Europe, Napoleon had been forced to work within a system of international power set by the established monarchies, terms framed by treaties and marriage alliances. Against Britain, the richest anti-revolutionary monarchist nation of all, he levied global economic sanctions and further isolated Britain by muscling Russia, Prussia and Austria into the sanctions regime. Napoleon was extremely sensitive towards humiliation. towards being humiliated as the Emperor of France and of France being humiliated. Unlike the Romanovs or the Habsburgs or other great royal houses which had ruled Russia and Austria, various other countries, for generations, he was the first generation of his own house. And so if he were to lose a battle or to be outmaneuvered in a diplomatic way, and if France was to be humiliated, it could cost him his throne. The deal that Napoleon struck with Tsar Alexander at Tilsit in 1807 forced Russia into his economic blockade of British trade. Napoleon's Anglophobia knew few bounds, but it wasn't paranoia. The British really were out to get him. He once said in a proclamation when he was first consul,
"People of France, the English government has betrayed the secret of its horrible policy to tear France asunder, reduce her to the rank of a second-rate power. These are the hideous successes for which England lavishes her gold, her promises, and her intrigues."
However, the continental blockade of Britain along thousands of miles of European coastline proved enormously complicated and nearly impossible to enforce. To stem breaches in the blockade and reinforce his isolation of Britain, Napoleon now needed to implement a different strategy. For centuries, Britain and Portugal had been allies. During the blockade, Portugal became an open door to Europe for British trade. In Lisbon, Napoleon said, Britain had
an inexhaustible spring of wealth, a constant resource, both as a port of call and as a base for naval expeditions.
To date, all of Napoleon's campaigns had been fought defensively. Now he went on the offensive. In November 1807, he sent 24,000 men into Portugal, and the next year 100,000 into Spain. There they met their nemesis, the greatest British soldier for 100 years, the Duke of Wellington. All the circumstances of my disasters, Napoleon later said of that war, are bound up in that fatal knot. The problem in Spain was that the revolutionary cause in the country, and so sentiment for Napoleon, was just too weak. The forces of reaction in the church, aristocracy and the peasantry were deeply entrenched. The people defined themselves by their religion and locality, and not by their class or political ideology. So the French had to fight to occupy Spanish cities and to stave off attacks from insurgent guerrillas. They had to mount 3 separate invasions of Portugal and pour more and more effort into the struggle, never to realise total victory. The morale of the French army suffered badly. War in Spain was astonishingly vicious. French soldiers were tortured by the Spanish, decapitated, skinned alive, and their genitals were mutilated. A French captain wrote that prisoners were found
sawed asunder between the 2 planks. One of my friends was buried alive in the ground, all but his head, which served as a mark for the savages to play at bowls.
For the anti-revolutionary nations of Europe, Napoleon's failure in Spain was a long-desired humiliation. His empire was a first-generation construct, just a few years old, and the asymmetric war that he was obliged to fight in the peninsula stretched the army's skills to the limit. To make matters worse, the entente cordiale that Napoleon believed he had with the Tsar of Russia was very definitely cooling. At the very apex of international politics, there can't be such a thing as genuine friendship, especially amongst rivals. Yet Napoleon convinced himself that he and the Tsar had a special bond over Britain. He was wrong. On Christmas Day 1810, the Tsar put out a decree which effectively meant that Russia was going to be able to trade with Britain once more. It was a major insult, an attack on Napoleon's prestige. It demanded retribution. For a man who is forever accused of cynicism, Napoleon was woefully trusting and even gullible when it came to the Tsar. Take a close look at Napoleon's letters, and a trusting nature and fragility of character are soon revealed. Napoleon was one of the most prodigious writers in history. He wrote or dictated an average of some 15 letters or documents a day. To his former wife Josephine, Napoleon had written fawning, puppy dog love letters. To his staff he poured out order after order after order. But at times, his correspondence betrays the acute sensitivities of the man, behind all the valour and bravado. I love reading Napoleon's letters. Here's a man who's capable of really expressing himself in his deepest emotions, even his vulnerabilities. He once wrote to a chief of staff saying that there is no greater coward than I when building his plan of campaign, and that it gave him almost a physical pain doing it. And speaking to a confidant, he said, "France must accept me for my flaws. My greatest flaw is an inability to accept insults." It was a devastatingly honest self-assessment. In time, that sensitivity, rendered more acute by the relentless aggression of the European monarchs and the social conservatism of the peoples of Europe, would exact a devastating price. In late 1811, humiliated by the Tsar, Napoleon initiated a second military front. As he later said of the Tsar's action and the Spanish campaign,
"Two ulcers ate into France's vitals. She could not bear them both at once. We must extract peace. It is at Moscow."
Napoleon now initiated the largest single military operation in history to date, an invasion of Russia. He amassed an imperial army of over 600,000 soldiers, larger than the entire population of Paris, a multinational force with almost half of the infantry born outside France. Napoleon left for Russia from here, the Palace of Saint-Cloud. He was well prepared. Diamonds had been sewn into the lining of his carriage in case of hurried flight. The Tsar had reneged on his deal with Napoleon, and the Emperor had planned a massive but strategically limited campaign to force him back into the fold. For the Emperor, it was to become a life or death struggle for his empire. From the outset, the campaign of 1812 was one of damnation. In June, the Grande Armée crossed the border into Russia. Unable to withstand such a huge force, the Russian army fell back. The following month, battle was joined with the Russians in the west, but the enemy continued to withdraw, sucking Napoleon further into the interior of the country. The shocking thing was that by that time, over 80,000 French soldiers had already died, and tens of thousands more were too ill for duty, and Napoleon had lost almost a third of his central strike force. The biggest killer was disease. Typhus had been endemic in Russia for decades, and then exhaustion. The army had misjudged the weather, and debilitating heat. Because of the immense length of supply lines, soldiers were forced to live off the land, and starvation set in. According to Karl von Suckow, a lieutenant serving in the Württemberg Guard,
Hundreds killed themselves, feeling unable to endure such hardship. Every day one heard isolated shots ring out in the woods near the road.
Napoleon pressed on, claiming the continued retreat of the Russians as evidence of a degenerate nation who don't know how to make either war or peace. The Grande Armée failed to outflank its enemy, and whenever the Russians fought, it was dragged deeper and deeper into the country. In August, Napoleon took Smolensk. Originally, he'd planned to fortify the city and spend the brutal Russian winter there. But he changed his mind, ignoring the advice of some of his most trusted marshals.
We have gone too far to turn back. Peace is in front of us. We are but 10 days' march from it, so near the goal. Let us march on Moscow.
Napoleon was desperate for the kind of decisive battle that had won him victory in the past. Having beaten the Russians twice before, this invasion was born of a rational self-belief rather than conceited imperialist hubris.
The problem with Napoleon in 1812 is not the things that go wrong after he captured Smolensk, but the very fact that he ever got as far as Smolensk in the first place. Once it became clear that his 3-week campaign concept was not going to work, and that his troops therefore weren't going to have the food necessary after those 3 weeks, he should have stopped where he was. He feared humiliation.
The determination of the Russian people to fight the advancing French was now attaining a near mystical pitch, their will as unbreakable as that of the Spaniards. Finally, 2 months after the French army had entered the country, the Russian army, under the command of Field Marshal Kutuzov, decided to stop their scorched earth withdrawal and stand and fight. A location was chosen at Borodino, 170 miles east of Smolensk. The main French attack on the Russian army started at dawn on the 7th of September. The Russians took a very strong defensive position, their right behind the river Kalacha, their left at Borodino village, and their centre at the large earthworks of the Great Redoubt. Then Napoleon's imagination failed him. Rather than seek to outflank his enemy, he opted for a near-suicidal frontal assault on the heavily defended redoubt, and the two armies battered each other into exhaustion.
There was no finesse to Borodino. It was a vicious slogging match, hand-to-hand, with musket butts and bayonets. Here in the Great Redoubt, warfare entered its modern phase, with mass bombardments and slaughter in trenches. This did not play to Napoleon's strengths, which were for strategic artistry and extravagant manoeuvres. The world, according to Napoleon, was dying.
After 2 cavalry charges, the French held on to their gains. However, in a second error, and despite entreaties once again from his marshals, Napoleon refused to send in his Imperial Guard to finish the Russians off. He was cautious, hesitating to commit the flower of his army over 170 miles away from his closest base of operations. During the night of the 7th of September, the Russians stole away. The French were too exhausted to stop them. Tens of thousands of men had already been lost in this campaign. As an officer was once quoted as saying,
"Any water to be found on the field was so soaked with blood that even the horses refused to drink it.
Napoleon defeated the Russians at Borodino, but he didn't rout them, which he desperately needed to do. He underestimated his enemy, something that was to become a trait in the future, but which had never happened in the battles of the past. Having misjudged the Russians militarily at Borodino, he was about to go on and to misjudge them politically, here at the very heart of their empire, 75 miles to the east, in Moscow.
On September the 14th, Napoleon and the French approached Moscow.
At last,
Napoleon said.
that famous city. It's about time.
Yet, in one of the starkest moments of 19th century military history, just when the Grande Armée entered Moscow, home to 250,000 people, just 15,000 remained there. The Russians had abandoned the city, their heroism testified to in a remarkable set of letters held today in the Russian National Archives. This is a letter from Tsar Alexander I to Count Rostopchin, the governor of Moscow, and it's all about creating the defences of the militia of Moscow. It was written 4 days after the fall of Smolensk, and it's quite clear that the Russian High Command now knows that Moscow is the next place that Napoleon's going to attack. Rostopchin was quite a controversial figure in Russian history. He was fanatically anti-French, to the point that in 1812 he actually burnt down his own chateau. He went from room to room, setting fire to it, and then put up a sign that said, "I have set fire to my chateau, which cost me $1 million to build, because I'm not going to have any dog of a Frenchman lodging in it." This letter is also to Rostopchin, this time from Barclay de Tolly, the great Russian general. Here he writes, "It is with sorrow in my soul that I have to inform Your Highness that we are going not to fight for Moscow again, but just to march the army through it and out the other side." Now, sorrow in my soul is not something that Barclay de Tolly, who was quite a dry as dust figure, he wasn't very prey to emotions. He didn't write that easily, but it was something that obviously echoed the feelings of many Russians. In Moscow, Napoleon's troubles escalated. He took up residence in the palace of the Kremlin and sought a negotiated peace with the Tsar. Alexander gave no answer. A great fire engulfed the city and raged unchecked for 3 days, started by Rostopchin and native Muscovites. Food was running out in the city. The Russian winter would soon be setting in. Napoleon should have left Moscow at once, but instead, in yet another critical decision of the campaign, he stayed for just over a month. Then, on the 18th of October, he took a decision that would carry enormous significance for his entire career. He had still not won a clear victory against Russia, but ordered the French army to retreat from Moscow. He shouldn't have been there in the first place.
It was a signature of Napoleon's success throughout his career that it was always the battle that mattered and not the capital. Yet in 1812, it was the capital that he focused on and not the battle. Was this a lust for conquest or his own personal vanity? No. It was simply that standing in the Sparrow Hills, looking down on the golden, onion-domed Moscow, he found capturing the city to be irresistible.
The retreat from Moscow presented Napoleon with the most important decision of his life. Within a week of leaving the city, he had a choice of routes back to Smolensk, a bold southern route through warmer, unspoilt countryside, but on which the Russian army was camped. A western route, along unmapped roads, or he could return the way he had come, along the devastated road to Smolensk. After an indecisive battle on the 24th of October, Napoleon decided to take the northern route. At least it had some food depots along that way. The decision was wrong and disastrous. What he didn't know was that the Russians were retreating from the southern route. The winter of 1812 was exceptionally cold. Minus 13 degrees during the day, minus 35 at night. The food depots on the northern route were insufficiently stocked, and the countryside had already been stripped of food and fodder. There was starvation, snow blindness, frostbite. Some French soldiers had to sleep inside disemboweled horses to avoid the cold. An officer in the Imperial Russian Army saw
corpses, from the thighs of which strips of flesh had been cut for eating. It looked like a caravan, a wandering nation,
wrote an aide-de-camp of Napoleon.
It is impossible to express the grief of Napoleon,
His chamberlain wrote,
the extreme agitation of his mind.
3 weeks later, savaged by conditions and attack from the Russians, the French finally arrived at Smolensk. How would they escape from Russia and exit this hell of a campaign? The question mattered since, advancing to the Berezina River in modern-day Belarus, the Grande Armée was now completely boxed in.
In the epic of Napoleon's invasion of Russia en route back home, a story of immense human disaster and serial catastrophes, there is no more perilous moment for Napoleon than here at the Berezina. 144,000 Russians were converging on his army of 55,000 men. He had a river to his back, the only bridge over which had been destroyed by the Russians. As Marshal Ney told a friend, "If Napoleon succeeds in getting us out of this today, he's the very devil."
Napoleon's army appeared to be hopelessly caught. In front of him, a fast-flowing, freezing cold river. Behind him, a large enemy. From the north, a second force of Russians was bearing down, and from the south, a third. What followed has to be one of the greatest escapes in all of military history.
The Russians, who were along that bank of the river, suspected that the French were going to attempt a crossing on this stretch of it. So, in a classic deceptive manoeuvre, Napoleon sent a force of 300 cuirassiers right the way down south there. They cut down trees and interviewed the locals and lit campfires, all to distract the Russians. But would it give Napoleon enough time and space to create an opening?
French staff officers could hardly believe their luck when they saw the Russian cavalry patrols ride off southward without so much as a glance over their shoulders. The lure appeared to have worked. The French identified an ideal site to bridge the river. But how would they cross?
400 Dutch sappers plunged up to their armpits in this freezing cold river. And I mean freezing cold, there were 6-foot blocks of ice that were floating down it. And some of them were swept away by the current, and others of them succumbed to hypothermia, even though you were only allowed to go in the water for 15 minutes each. But what the rest of them achieved was something that I think stands up in the annals of military history, because it was a miracle of escape. They managed to build two 300-foot long and 12-foot wide bridges, and they did it in only 3 hours. And it was across these that Napoleon's army escaped, 55,000 of them. The story wasn't so happy for the 20,000 camp followers and stragglers who were stuck on this side of the bank, especially after the French army set fire to the bridges at the end. They were caught in complete pandemonium and panic, and when the Russian army got here, they were massacred.
The campaign had seen a catalogue of mistakes. Of the men in the central column that advanced on Moscow in 1812, 95% had either died or been captured. By my calculation, almost 2/3 of the campaign force died from causes other than military action. Everything that had gone wrong was down to Napoleon, yet he blamed the whole frightful calamity, as he described it in a proclamation to the French nation, on so cruel a season, i.e. the weather. He argued that he had been defeated by savage nature rather than by his own poor judgment. But on his return to Paris, the most phenomenal thing happened. He not only survived the political fallout, he built another army.
Within 2 months of the retreat from Moscow, Napoleon was back here at the Arc du Carrousel, and then he attended an exhibition of painting at the Louvre. To all appearances, it was business as usual. The sheer scale of the losses in Russia would have felled most military leaders, but not Napoleon. Within 2 months, he had built up an entirely new army of 350,000 men. It was a testament to how much France still believed in him.
The root of Napoleon's power in France had been the conservative middle class. Revolution had given them their land, taken from the monarchy, aristocracy and church, and the emperor had protected their interests at home and abroad. Although conscription was deeply unpopular, overall they were still prepared to continue to supply their sons to the cause of France and the glory of their emperor. As one of Napoleon's closest advisors said,
The entire nation overlooked Napoleon's reverses and vied with one another in displaying zeal and devotion. It was a personal triumph for the emperor. Things seemed to come into existence as if by magic.
Yet the anti-revolutionary powers now saw Napoleon's weakness and smelled blood. A new alliance, this time of all the major powers in Europe, now formed against him, and they advanced what they called a holy war. With battle lines drawn in northwest and central Europe, the French army won some military successes against Russia and Prussia in the spring of 1813, but then, in a startling change of tactics, the Allied powers agreed amongst themselves only to attack Napoleon's marshals and then fall back when he himself was present. The strategy worked. By autumn 1813, 500,000 men assembled to fight the largest battle in European history thus far. At the Battle of Leipzig in Germany, known as the Battle of the Nations, sheer weight of numbers forced Napoleon to fight only the second defensive battle of his career. He was defeated resoundingly, with the loss of no fewer than 33 generals.
When he quitted Leipzig,
Recalled the King of Saxony's aide-de-camp,
he was bathed in sweat from bodily exertion and mental disturbance combined.
the Allies now carried out a relentless drive to invade France. Napoleon faced 300,000 Russians, Prussians and Austrians on the Rhine. In the campaign of France that followed, the Grande Armée fought no fewer than 12 battles to save La Patrie. With Napoleon in the field, outright opposition formed in government and in Paris. On the 31st of March 1814, Tsar Alexander I entered Paris at the head of the Russian army. With enemy forces encamped in the fields of the Champs-Élysées, Napoleon became the first French leader to lose Paris to enemy occupation for almost 400 years.
With the capture of Paris, Tsar Alexander I came to stay here at the house of Talleyrand, the political leader of the opposition to Napoleon in France. So this place became both the nerve centre of the Allied occupation and the political headquarters of the Russian Empire. Coming here represented total victory for the Russians. Not only had they avenged the invasion of 1812, but they had also deposed its leader, and they had eclipsed the power of the Napoleonic Empire.
Within just a year and a half, Napoleon had paid the price of his disaster in Russia. The energy of the 49-year-old leader was not in doubt. In the 65-day-long 1814 campaign alone, Napoleon covered 1,000 miles on horseback and slept in 48 different places. In one 5-day period, he won 4 battles in a row. However, as he himself said,
I'm afraid to admit that I have waged war too much.
the fathers and sons of the French middle classes were also no longer prepared to enlist for military service.
By 1814, France was utterly exhausted and unwilling to heed the Emperor's call. The economy was ruined after 22 years of war. The cavalry had been decimated by the retreat from Moscow, and men were unwilling to be conscripted into the army. Napoleon was ready and willing to fight on after the fall of Paris. His people weren't.
The day before the European powers occupied Paris, Talleyrand, a former ally of Napoleon, staged a coup against him and set up a provisional government. Within days, the entirely Napoleon-appointed Senate deposed the emperor and invited a Bourbon onto the throne. On the 4th of April, at the Palace of Fontainebleau outside Paris, Napoleon met his 8 remaining marshals to consider their options. Napoleon wanted to march on Paris, but his senior advisors, some of whom, like Marshals Ney and Oudinot and MacDonald, had been by his side from the early days of his career, refused. Napoleon could have precipitated a civil war, but instead he agreed to abdicate. The Allies offered him the sovereignty of Elba, an island in the Mediterranean. On the 20th of April, Napoleon departed for Elba. 8 days earlier, he had attempted suicide, but failed.
This staircase at Fontainebleau saw the most emotional scene of the entire Napoleonic epic. "Soldiers of my guard," Napoleon said to his troops on the 20th of April 1814, "for 20 years you have fought in the path of honour and glory. Farewell, my children. I should like to clasp each of you to my breast, but instead I shall embrace your flag." He then kissed the flag and got into his carriage and left for Elba. There wasn't a dry eye in the house.
Elba proved to be little more than gardening leave for Napoleon, who remained for many French people their legitimate leader. They feared the seizure of their property by the monarchy, and the Bourbons behaved with petty vindictiveness in their 10 months in power. Which is why, on the 26th of February 1815, Napoleon left Elba for France, accompanied by only 650 men of his imperial guard. He was greeted as a hero on his return. The European powers declared him an enemy and disturber of the world, confirming him for many Frenchmen as a revolutionary patriot. And Napoleon marched on Paris.
On the 20th of March 1815, Napoleon arrived at the Tuileries and was carried up the stairs in triumph. The tricolour flew over the palace once again, and slogans started appearing on the walls of the city. Down with the priests, death to the royalists, Bourbons to the scaffold. It was the great French novelist Honoré de Balzac who said, "Did ever a man before in history win a great empire simply by showing his hat?"
Napoleon is always portrayed as a warmonger, and yet the British declared war against him in 1803, the Austrians and Russians in 1805, the Russians and Prussians in 1806, and the Austrians again in 1809. The campaigns of 1813 and 1814 were similarly initiated by the Allied powers, and so it was inevitable that in response to Napoleon retaking Paris in 1815, the Allies would want to overthrow the Corsican ogre for a second time. The Allies were set on vengeance, while Napoleon was prepared to put the past behind him.
Of all that individuals have done or written since the taking of Paris,
Napoleon said,
I shall forever remain ignorant.
For Wellington, this was the opportunity to destroy what he called this disgusting and fraudulent tyranny of Bonaparte. For Napoleon, it was also clear that there was going to be a decisive battle. "We shall emerge victorious," he said, "from this struggle of a great people against its oppressors."
By decree in March 1815, Napoleon scaled up the army. He made it clear to the Allied powers that he wanted peace, but it had no impact upon them. He renounced all imperial ideas.
Henceforth, the happiness and the consolidation of France shall be the object of all my thoughts,
he wrote. At a huge political and military rally in Paris, he braced France for the inevitable challenge.
Emperor, consul, soldier, I owe everything to the people. In prosperity, in adversity, on the battlefield, in council, enthroned, in exile, France has been the sole and constant object of my thoughts and actions. Frenchmen, tell the citizens that we are at a great moment.
Napoleon determined to strike north into Belgium at the only major Allied force within easy reach before they could be reinforced. He sought to interpose the French army between the armies of Prussia and Britain and then defeat them both in detail. He dispatched one force under Marshal Ney to engage the Anglo-Allied force at Quatre Bras, but they were able to make an orderly withdrawal to a previously reconnoitred defensive position on the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean. Meanwhile, Napoleon attacked the Prussians at Ligny, some 9 miles away. The Prussians were defeated, but able to reorganize.
Disperse to manoeuvre, concentrate to fight. That was a fundamental military maxim of Napoleon's warfare. And yet here, on the battlefield of Ligny, he did the exact opposite. Napoleon sent Marshal Grouchy off in that direction with 30,000 men and 98 guns to try to find the Prussians. He had no council of war, he was given no advice. All the people who could have given him strategic advice, Lannes, Desailles, were dead. Now, there was no one close at hand to tell him that he was wrong.
The Duke of Wellington later called it the most important decision of the 19th century. For Grouchy never found the Prussians till it was too late. In a brilliantly counterintuitive move, the Prussian Chief of Staff took his forces northwards to stay in touch with the Anglo-Allied army. It meant that 50,000 Prussians were now free to join battle. On the 18th of June, 1815, the day after a tumultuous thunderstorm, the French and Anglo-Allied armies were set to meet at Waterloo, on one of the smallest battlefields that Napoleon had ever fought on, a little over 3 miles across. According to the Duke of Wellington, it would be a battle of giants. For Napoleon,
the battle that is coming will save France and will be remembered in the annals of the world. I shall have my artillery fire and my cavalry charge.
Napoleon was marching up this road here with a force of 72,000 men and 246 guns. And he was going to try to break through Wellington's line, which really stretched the whole way here up through there. And Wellington had 68,000 men and 157 guns. Now, for Napoleon, this was going to be a classic central massive thrust. But what he didn't know was that on the morning of the battle, Field Marshal Blücher, who was right over there in Wavre, about 9 miles away, had promised Wellington that he was going to turn up with 2 army corps, which was about 2/3 of his entire force, and he was going to smash in the French right flank. For Napoleon, the terms of engagement were about to change radically.
The battle started with a fight developing at the Hougoumont farmhouse. Napoleon's options for the kind of grand, sweeping, outflanking manoeuvre that had won him so many battles in the past were closed down by the dispositions Wellington made and the topography of the ground.
The farmhouse here at La Haye-Sainte saw the crisis moment of the battle. It provided Napoleon with his last and best opportunity for breaking Wellington's line. So he sent in his crack unit, the Imperial Guard, on both sides of this farmhouse. But it was a much depleted force because he'd had to send so many men to fight off the Prussians on his right flank. Throughout his career, Napoleon had tried to outflank and envelop his enemy. This time, his enemy was doing it to him.
The French Imperial Guard was used to administering the coup de grace against a defeated enemy, but now Napoleon was forced to use it as a last-ditch attempt to save the day. This time they were simply unable to break through the enemy line. Once the Guard was seen to be thrust back, the French army cried out in shock, "La Garde recule," a cry that had not been heard on any battlefield since the formation of the Guard, and it was the sign for the general disintegration of the French army across the entire front. At 8 p.m, the cry "Sauve qui peut" went up, "Save yourselves," and Napoleon took a comrade by the arm and said,
Come, General. The affair is over. We've lost the day. Let us be off.
It was here that the Imperial Guard made its last stand at the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon came here amidst the utter chaos of a beaten and disintegrating army. He stayed as long as he could until there was no hope, and then he made his escape. It was a catastrophic defeat, and unlike the retreat from Moscow, it was an escape from which there could be no return.
One month after Waterloo, Napoleon surrendered to the British. "Incomprehensible day," he later said of the battle. "I sensed that fortune was abandoning me." Many complex theories have been advanced for his downfall, but to my mind, it's quite simple. Napoleon had launched an economic war against Britain, who had refused to make peace with him. To enforce the blockade, he had invaded Portugal and Spain, which went wrong and badly weakened him. He entered into an alliance with Russia and had trusted Tsar Alexander, but the Tsar had reneged on the deal. To force Russia back into the fold, he invaded the country. The campaign was a disaster. The Napoleonic spell was over. In early August 1815, Napoleon left for exile on a remote volcanic island in the Atlantic Ocean. The British government had dispatched him to a place where he would never again be able to disturb the peace of Europe.
Napoleon sailed to St Helena humiliated, but at least he hadn't been executed, thanks to the decency of the British. The voyage lasted 10 weeks, and then he spent 5.5 years on the island. It would have broken most men, but Napoleon typically used the time to become history's greatest exile.
With supreme irony, Napoleon was held prisoner here at Longwood House, a place with all of the serene, stultifying atmosphere of an English suburban villa. It was to protect all of the gains of the French Revolution that Napoleon had built an empire of 45 million people. He had enshrined the rights of the individual and the family in the Code Napoleon. He had fundamentally reformed a nation. Yet his rule was undone by just 2 acts of aggression, both designed to force Britain to the negotiating table. Napoleon hated St Helena. By 1821, he was thoroughly depressed and very ill. Like the ancient Athenian politician Themistocles, Napoleon lived in the middle of the plains of Persia, ever missing his country.
Napoleon died here in this very room. There have been endless conspiracy theories about how he was poisoned, but actually, when the 7 doctors opened him up at the post-mortem, they found that he had rampant stomach cancer, which was the disease that killed his father. For me, what's much more interesting is why didn't he commit suicide? He'd spoken about suicide, written about it, he admired figures in history who committed suicide, and he'd actually attempted to commit suicide himself 7 years earlier. He hated living on what he called this accursed rock. He was terminally depressed and innately bored. Why didn't he do it? For whatever reason, he decided that he was going to let nature take its course. That required a different kind of courage.
Napoleon was a man who gave birth to the modern. He fiercely promoted meritocracy and defended justice based upon reason rather than feudal whim. As a young man, he idolized history's great captains, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. By the time of his death, he had achieved the ambition he once conceived of as a schoolboy. He had joined the ancients.
After Napoleon, there was no turning back from the days of feudal privilege when an individual's worth was judged on his parents' social status rather than the content of his character. In the words of Sir Winston Churchill, the impetus of the French Revolution was spread by the genius of Napoleon. Ideals of liberty and nationalism were imparted to all the peoples. It was a formidable and enduring legacy.
"19 years after his death, Napoleon's body was moved from St Helena to Paris. He was interred on the anniversary both of his coronation and the Battle of Austerlitz, the 2 greatest moments of an extraordinary life.
If you missed drama documentary Armada 12 Days to Save England, all 3 episodes are available now on BBC iPlayer. And we continue with the fallout of Waterloo next here on BBC Two, and the appalling conditions faced by the sick and wounded, secrets of a war hospital next.